If you're interested in consulting, whether it be on software development, nutrition, or any number of issues, what are the factors that you need to consider when determining whether to form an entity? There's 7 different instances when you would want to form a business entity. First, if there are more than one founder. If you're consulting, it's likely you're going to be consulting on your own. But if you are consulting with another individual or other individuals, you'll want to make sure you form an entity so you can determine the equity split in the company. You want to avoid having any misunderstandings as to who owns what percentage ownership interest in the company. You'll also want to set up an entity if you're developing intellectual property, especially if there's more than one owner involved in the company. This is important because if there isn't an entity formed and intellectual property is developed and that founder or owner leaves the company, that founder can take the intellectual property with them. If you form an entity and all of the founders contribute their intellectual property into it, then you ensure that the intellectual property is intact. You'll also want to form an entity before you get financing from an outside investor. For most consultants are not getting investment from venture capitalists. But if you're getting investment from an outside investor, especially one who wants preferred returns or they want to receive their profits in the company before the founders, then you'll need to form an entity which will allow for that to happen. So you want to form a limited liability company or some type of corporation. If the company needs to hire employees or contractors, it's preferable to actually have the entity enter into the agreement with the employee or the independent contractor as opposed to the individual founder. For the contractor, you want to form the entity so that if the independent contractor is creating IP, then that IP that's being created will be transferred or signed into the entity. The 5th reason why you would want to form an entity is if you want to issue options to your employees or your independent contractors. For consultants, again, this may not be as relevant, but if you want to issue options to compensate your employees or independent contractors, you need to set up a distinct business entity in order to do so, and you would have to set up a C corporation in order to issue stock options. Another reason why you want to form an entity is to avoid liability. When you set up a distinct business entity, such as a limited liability company or a corporation, you're able to avoid the debts and obligations of the company. If you don't set up a separate entity, then you will be personally liable for all of the debts and obligations of the company. Even if you do set up an LLC or a corporation, be aware that there are certain exceptions to the limited liability protection of the company, such as providing professional services such as practicing law or practicing medicine. And if you're involved in one of those services, then you'll be responsible for any malpractice that you commit. Even if you have formed a limited liability company or a corporation, it's important to be aware that there may be exceptions to that limited liability. And the final reason why you would want to form an entity is if you'd like to obtain a visa. If you're a non-US citizen or a non-resident alien, then you'll need to work with an immigration attorney to determine how to legally work in the United States. If you form an entity and make sure that it's operating and fully capitalized, you may be able to obtain a visa this way.